Hello, everyone who's joining. We're just going to leave just a minute or two to allow the people to enter the Zoom room. Allow another 30 seconds. Okay, let's just get started. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's event, which is focusing on the role that government could or should play in enabling a shift towards diets that are more sustainable and healthy, and including for the climate. That's particularly the focus of our discussion this evening. I'm Tara Garnett, I'm the director of Table, and for those of you who don't know, Table is a collaboration between the universities of Oxford, Wageningen and the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, with more universities joining in the coming months. And we explore issues and debates around the future of food. Tonight is the third in a series of 3 events that we've been organising in the run-up to the COP. The first focused on nitrogen in the food system, and the second looked at the contested topic of nature-based solutions, and they're both available to watch online. There'll be details in the chat. But in tonight's session, we take a look at the role of one particular actor in the food system, government, and ask what role government should and could play in shifting diets in more sustainable, healthy, and equitable directions. Before I go any further and introduce the speakers, I just wanted to share a slide taken from a paper in Science that was lead authored by my colleague Mike Clark at Oxford. Jackie, if you're able to share that slide, that would be great. It's my one slide of the evening, and all it does is sort of set the scene. What this slide shows is business as usual projections in greenhouse gas emissions from the food system, that's the black column, through to 2100. And what that shows is that emissions from food alone are going to get to the emissions allowable for a 2-degree warming limit, which is higher than what we have what we actually want to be going in order to reduce emissions from the food. And that means that there'll be no other allowable emissions from any other area of activity, from organising Zoom calls to heating our homes to transport to clothing, anything else. It's all gobbled up by food. So in order to get emissions down, in part to allow other areas of human activity to also have some kind of breathing space, as it were, Mike and colleagues modelled a range of actions from improving yield, so production side measures, reducing waste, improving the efficiency of production, and also rebalancing our calorie intake so that we don't overconsume and those who underconsume increase their consumption. But what it found was that none of these measures on their own is sufficient. We need also to be shifting our diets for high consuming individuals away from diets that are very high in animal products. And if we do that, then we stand within a chance of meeting the 1.5-degree limit. It's not going to be easy, but what it very, very clearly shows is that shifting diets in that direction is going to be essential. So that's it from me when it comes to that slide. So the need for dietary change is undeniable, notwithstanding differences depending on who you are, where you are in the world, your income, your starting point, your land, everything. But but that is the direction of travel. So that brings me back to the role of government. If this is the direction we need to be going in, what is the role of government in making it happen? What are the opportunities for and obstacles to action? So tonight we have three great panelists, Danush Dinesh, who's the founder of the NGO Klimeet in the Netherlands, Arganun Fahikta, who's a nutrition mainstreaming expert at the FAO, and Dustin Benton, Policy Director at the Green Alliance, a UK NGO. I'm not going to spend time introducing them fully, but all their full bios will be posted in the chat. So the format we have for this evening is going to be 2-minute opening statements from each of them, followed by a fairly free-flowing panel discussion, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience for the final half hour. Please do post your questions in the Q&A whenever you want, and don't do it in the chat, although you can post in the chat. It just helps it easier for us to figure out what's a question and what's a comment. And then finally, I should just say that this event is being recorded and will be available to watch in the next few days on our website and on YouTube. So that's it from me. So over to you, Danush.
Thank you, Tara, and thanks for having me. And thanks for that really compelling slide. And for me, what I took away was how does the policy-making process work? The slide you showed is from the paper in 2020. And quite a lot of these things we've known for several years, right? The need for dietary shifts. But the fact is that it's not happening at the policy level, and policymaking doesn't always respond to evidence. I did my PhD studying how science informs policy, and very often it's not like a straightforward process of getting the evidence out there and people respond. That's just a point I want to put out there. Maybe there is somebody contests it and it's a debate. But then when I look at the COP process, we're setting the table for COP28 now, and I've been going to all the COPs since COP21. And what we see is year on year, there's a bigger push from the food community to make food a big part of the solution in the climate narrative. And Emirates COP in Dubai, it's being positioned as the food moment, the Paris moment for food. So there's a lot of excitement amongst the food community that food will be featured in Dubai. And what do we know is about the COP is that, there's a negotiation stream on agriculture, which is still going on. And in addition to that, there will be a heads of state level declaration on food systems. And this is really big. And the expectation is that countries recognize the importance of food systems as a climate solution. That's great. But my challenge is then you say all this and it's like, it sounds really great, but it doesn't really get into the details. It doesn't recognize the need to shift diets, and it doesn't recognize that because there's pushback from certain countries on acknowledging this. So the first point I'd like to make is that, COP28 food moment, great, but are we addressing the right issues at the right level of detail? And my feeling is that no. And the second point I'd like to make is, and why is that happening? And I've been working with many of these countries over the years, observing the processes, and I'm just not seeing that leadership coming from countries or groups of countries to say, yes, dietary shifts are important. We need to bring this to the COP. It needs to be part of the process. That's just not happening. Some people say, okay, we found a new study, we want more evidence. But then others say, no, if you put that, that's a red line and we don't cross that, So it's just been sidetracked. And you say the big words about food systems. What's the point if you don't address or show leadership on shifting diets, because it's important. Third point, and I have two more points, I'll do it quickly, is on implementation. Even when people have promised things, since COP21 I've been going, there's been a lot of things promised on agriculture. We're just not seeing it being delivered. So we can probably, as NGOs, advocate for shifting diets being included, but that's not giving us a guarantee that it'll actually be happening. So we, as an NGO community or scientific community, we need to step up our game on how we are going to engage in these processes and push for that action that we really know is needed.
Thank you. Well, that was quite a depressing start. So, let me just move on to Arganun. If you could make your statement, please.
Sure. Thank you so much, Tara, and thanks for having FAO on this panel. So let me just start by sharing Dr. Nancy Aburto's regards and regrets that she was unable to join today due to a last-minute urgent obligation. But on behalf of FAO, I'm pleased to be here to ensure that we are a part of today's discussion, because we do recognize that climate change and malnutrition are two of the greatest challenges facing humanity. Malnutrition alone costs roughly $3.5 trillion a year, and climate change is estimated to cost $180 trillion by 2070. Further, we know that 1 in 3 people around the world suffer from malnutrition, and no country is free of malnutrition or the negative impacts of climate change. And these challenges disproportionately affect the most vulnerable populations of our society, being women, children, and young people. I welcome today's conversation on changing diets, because this is one of the many opportunities that evidence shows us can accelerate advances on linking climate change and nutrition actions. As already been mentioned, we know business as usual is not enough. And so we must all embrace innovative solutions to these intractable challenges to accelerate the progress towards SDG 2 and SDG 13 to reach the ambitions that we have for Agenda 2030. We're very proud at FAO to be a part of the Initiative on Climate Action and Nutrition, and I hope to be able to speak a bit more of this in the panel. But this initiative brings together the climate and nutrition communities, which is often a missing link in these dialogues. It was launched last year by the government of Egypt as the president of COP27. At the global level, FAO is also part of the Secretariat of the UN Food Systems Summit Coalition for Action on Healthy Diets from Sustainable Food Systems. And these are just 2 examples of bringing together policy action and investments for addressing climate and malnutrition simultaneously, along, of course, with many other efforts and support to our member countries. Many of these specifics, I'm sure, will be covered, and the integrated actions will be covered today. But as we talk about what it takes to change diets, we know that we need to reinforce efforts at the individual level, but we also need to ensure availability, accessibility, affordability of nutritious foods for healthy diets, which requires actions across the entire food system. So I'll stop there, and thank you once again for the opportunity to join, and I look forward to the discussion on this important topic.
Thank you. And over to Dustin now for a more UK national focused overview.
Thanks very much, Tara. So I should probably say, yes, I'm coming at this from a national perspective. I think it hopefully fits nicely as an addendum to the sort of international perspectives we've just had. I should say I sort of cut my teeth on the chief analyst for the National Food Strategy here in the UK. And so I'm going to just briefly share with you all some of the framing context that we used in order to build a case for diet change in this government-sponsored independent review, the National Food Strategy. And I guess the sort of simple version of the story about how to do this is you need to build a highly evidence-driven case. Certainly, we found that trying to persuade governments was, diets are difficult. Let's be honest. Sort of no politician wants to be accused of telling an individual what to eat. So you need to build that evidence case very strongly. You then need to build a mandate for change, and there's a political mandate for change, and there's a public mandate for change, which I'm sure we can come into in the questions. And then you need good policy. So I'll start just by sharing with you how we built the kind of evidence case that we used to persuade our stakeholders in the National Food Strategy that there was a case for government intervention on action. So hopefully you should be seeing a slide up very shortly. Yes, great. So this is a schematic map of the United Kingdom and the land that is used to feed the country. The simple message that this shows is that we use about 72% of the land surface of the United Kingdom to grow food that's consumed in the UK and an equivalent area overseas. And the analysis that we did looking at meeting the UK's net zero law, meeting its nature goals, and indeed addressing some of the, what I guess the FAO calls malnutrition, but which we more often refer to in the UK as diet-related disease, because generally speaking, a country like the UK suffers from overabundance rather than undernutrition, but it's malnutrition nonetheless. What this should hopefully show you quite quickly is that we use an awful lot of land, perhaps too much, and we need more land for nature and for carbon removals. And the distribution of this land is highly uneven. So this shows just the land that provides 2/3 of our food. The other land, I'll flip back, provides 100%. But it's the 15% of land that grows plants that people eat directly that provides the 2/3 of our food. So if you want to make space for nature, for climate reasons, then you end up being forced to have a conversation about meat consumption in a country like the UK, which is a high meat eater. This is incredibly politically problematic, I should say, but the analysis drives you there. Where we came into it from the food strategies perspective, there was actually diet-related disease. So these bubbles show you the relative number of DALYs, which is a measure of ill health and early death, based on different risk factors. And what you'll see is that for the top 5 are diet-related disease drivers. It's only tobacco that is largest. So if you want to address ill health, then you have to address diet. And just speaking a little bit to the building the political mandate for change, I don't want to bore you all to death with slides, but these bubbles show the relative amount of spending that the UK allocates to just treating obesity and overweight related illnesses. So that's the little sort of orange bubble. And the rough scale of that spending in a country like the UK is equivalent to what we spend on the police and fire services. Context in the UK is that the total amount that we spend on the NHS has shot up since the pandemic, and it is being driven up principally by a rise in diet-related disease. So in simple terms, the case that we made, I will stop showing my slides now, is there is a strongly evidence-led reason why governments have to think about diet change. It's very difficult to work your way around it, either from a health, it's impossible from a health perspective. And even from an environmental perspective, it's incredibly difficult to torture yourself into systems that don't involve diet change if you want to meet your nature and climate goals. And so essentially governments need to own up to it. And then the question is, how do you build good policy and a public mandate to deliver on that need for diet change?
Thank you so much, Dustin. So what we've heard so far from Danush is a kind of weariness about the fact that despite the enormous body of evidence that we've heard from all the speakers, there seems to be very little willingness to engage in the really difficult tasks that are needed to shift our diet. So there's a leadership gap. And then even where you get some kind of leadership, there's an implementation gap. At the intergovernmental level, Argunun has highlighted the fact that there are these communities of experts and practice who are talking and willing to talk to one another, and yet nothing seems to be happening. And then Dustin has talked about a very, very detailed process that took place in the UK of consultation and evidence gathering and synthesis and so forth, which led to a fairly resounding rejection by the UK government for action. So that's the kind of the bad news. So I guess the good news is that if they don't jump, they'll be pushed. And so the question is, what can government do? Firstly, I think there's the question of what are the ingredients necessary for the leadership that Danush is talking about? And secondly, what are the sorts of things that governments could be doing to change, to help us to shift in more sustainable and healthy directions? Which of those are evidence-based, and which of those are let's say, wishful thinking, that if with some measures there may be a kind of an inverse relationship between the ease of doing them and the effectiveness of them. So I don't know who wants to kick off with perhaps on the leadership question. Danush, go ahead.
Just kick off, Tara, just a couple of ingredients, as you mentioned, that can help, what I see. I think, and I'm talking about this in the COP context and UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change context. So it's about those who have voices there is the countries, right? As observers, we can put together messages, position papers. I've seen at least 2 calls to actions which are being put out. We can do all of that, but that doesn't matter in the formal process. What is recorded is the voice of countries. So I think what we could do is try to bring together a coalition of determined countries who are actually making this case internally. I really like the example from Dustin on the UK. But then when the UK goes to the climate change negotiations, they don't share this. They're really sticking to agriculture, sustainable agriculture. Those are the terms they use. Why doesn't the UK bring these lessons into the formal agriculture negotiations processes and say, we feel that it needs to incorporate shifting diets? And G77 will say, no, that's a red flag. But they need to be more showing that leadership to push that conversation. So I think if we can move a critical mass of countries in that direction, that'll help. The second ingredient, which I think is also maybe challenging our FAO colleague a little bit, is I think FAO has to be always very diplomatic because it's a UN organization and not use these strong terms. And I don't work for the FAO anymore, so I can use that. But I think FAO should show more leadership as well, push countries to incorporate this into national programs in the countries that you're working in. And bring those country level examples back. Very often when we are looking at low and middle income countries, many of them don't have the support in terms of policy making as a country like the UK might have. So is there a way that the UN agencies can actually, rather than being in a perfectly diplomatic and neutral stance, push for what the evidence is showing is needed in the countries where they are able to provide technical support? I think that could also help feedback.
Again, would you like to respond on that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the comment, Danush. And I would definitely say that well, from what I understand, you've worked with FAO because you said not any longer. But of course, there is a balance that needs to be made when working as a UN agency versus, for example, working with an NGO or civil society. And that is the fact that we need to respond to our member countries' requests and demands and the support that they seek within all conversations, including this one, which is around climate and diets. But particularly for this COP, we really hope, and we are advocating for aiming to get healthy diets and nutrition high on the agenda and to raise awareness on this win-win opportunity to tackle climate and nutrition simultaneously. And one concrete example of where these types of aspects could be incorporated are, for example, in the country's NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, as well as in NAPs and national adaptation plans, and how they can consider integration of nutrition for reaching their climate goals and supporting the overall sustainable development. And then I just wanted to quickly, if time allows, touch on also some tools that I don't know how familiar the audience are with them, but there are tools in place which FAO supports governments of all countries to develop and implement and disseminate. Among them, we find the the food-based dietary guidelines. And currently we are revising the guidance for this to incorporate a food systems lens, which will be published towards the end of the year. And food-based dietary guidelines, they're intended to establish a basis for public food and nutrition, health and agricultural policies and nutrition education programs to basically foster healthy eating habits and lifestyles. But what we tend to do with this new guidance around food systems for dietary guidelines is incorporate the sustainability perspective as well, and ensuring that countries have the tools available to be able to also incorporate environmental and basically climate considerations to their food-based dietary guidelines. And this is a really concrete tool where you can see countries, and they have already actually done so, incorporating environmental sustainability into their FPDGs, which are done at the local level, which are done through a multi-stakeholder and multi-sectoral approach from within that the government leads, of course, with the support of different expertise. And just some examples of countries that have done so in the recent years are Mexico, Chile, Myanmar, Qatar, the Nordics. You might be familiar with the new nutrition recommendations coming out of the Nordics. And so there, I would say we have a really concrete policy tool, which is coming from the governments themselves through these type of multi-stakeholder and multi-sectoral processes to make the change and the shift towards more healthy diets that are coming from sustainable food systems.
And do we have evidence that these food-based dietary guidelines, well, firstly, lead to changed recommendations in relation to animal product consumption in high-consuming nations, and secondly, that they lead to changes in actual practice when it comes to consumption, perhaps when it comes to public procurement in schools, prisons, hospitals, etc.?
So what research tells us, and we have a whole team actually in the Food and Nutrition Division working specifically on food-based dietary guidelines, and there's a page on the FAO website as well where you can find more information. But what research tells us is that if a country follows their food-based dietary guidelines, they're inevitably also being more basically providing more sustainable in terms of environmental aspects compared to if they weren't. So it kind of goes hand in hand. If you do follow the FBDGs, you are also contributing to nature positive outcomes for the climate as well. So that's what the evidence has told us so far.
Do you mind if I jump in here? I can't speak globally, but certainly in the UK, the evidence is that people aren't following the health-based guidelines that we have today. I mean, from memory, the average British person eats 2 of their 5 fruit and veg a day. So I think guidelines are very helpful. They're an important signaling factor. If you use them as a tool to link to other policies, like support for people on low incomes to be able to eat healthy diets, saying this is what a healthy and sustainable diet is, and society, sort of decides to support you to be able to eat that, that's really powerful. The signaling effect is meaningful, but we have known for I hesitate to say how many decades that eating more fruit and veg in the context of a sort of Western style diet is an unequivocal win for your personal health. And yet there are factors within the food system that make that very unlikely. And I think we should probably name at least one of them. In the National Food Strategy, we called it the junk food cycle. And this is that the economics of the system drive us to eat poor quality food from a health perspective. And some of this is also problematic from a climate perspective. We have made cheap meat and dairy, cheap grains, cheap fats available. And there's an entire food industry that can't help but use these products or use these ingredients to make the kind of complex products that personally I eat far too much of. This is not a question of kind of personal moral virtue. These are incredibly flavorful things with big companies that are engineering them to be tasty. And if we want to achieve dietary change, we need to at least understand the economics of the system in order to be able to intervene. That does, Tara, I'm afraid, lead us back to some of the difficulties in that if it were just a question of providing the right information, and information is important, then we would have one tricky problem, but we also have an economic challenge in that there are lots of companies that are currently making money out of a food system that makes us sick and is destroying the planet.
May I come in just quickly here, Tara?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just very quickly. Thank you for your comment. But just to mention, of course, information alone doesn't drive the change. You need to obviously have multiple efforts in place to actually achieve the change, and which results in I think the aim that we are all looking at, to achieve healthier diets from sustainable food systems. But what I think the role of governments is, and the importance of governments by using a tool such as the food-based dietary guidelines, is having that cross-sectoral collaboration within the government. So if, for example, the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Health are promoting certain types of foods, it doesn't mean necessarily that that is going to be achieved without the support of the Ministry of Trade or the Ministry of Education or the Ministry of so forth. You understand what I mean? So basically, I think a key element that needs to come into place to actually achieve these changes is the interdialogues within the government as well. And trying, and at least as FAO, trying to promote those internal dialogues in order to achieve the change that we want to see.
Thank you. So, I mean, I think those are really interesting points. I'm just going to go back to Danish's original point, which was the lack of leadership. And I think it, you know, if you think about the obvious reason for that, it's fear of your voters, really, fear of losing of losing the next election, and of course, opinion polls show that on the list of things that people are prepared to do, changing their diets and eating less meat comes up quite low. There's a real reluctance. That said, and when you engage people in sort of deliberative dialogue about the facts and the information, and perhaps Dustin can talk a little bit about the National Food Strategy process, then there's a kind of sense that, oh, why didn't you tell us this before? We're much more kind of willing to countenance this thing. But somehow even with those dialogue processes, there is this fear. So I guess my question is, what can we do to how can governments be bold and or take their voters with them, persuade their voters? What can they do? It's a big question.
If you're happy, I'll jump in, because I had a failed attempt to do this, as you kindly pointed out, Tara. The National Food Strategy's recommendations, about half of them, I think, have been taken up, but not the really big ones on, we proposed a sugar and salt tax designed to support reformulation, and that was not taken forward. A number of other things weren't as well. I'm an American, so I'm going to call it deferred success. But the point of, you know, how do you actually avoid this backlash? I think first you need to segment your voters a bit more carefully. Yes, you know, when you ask people cold, what do you think about diet change? Generally, people's reaction is no thanks. This is not something that is on their agenda. But actually, when you provide even a most minimal prompt, and we did both set a long and pretty sophisticated set of deliberative dialogues in the National Food Strategy. We spoke to, gosh, probably the best part of 2,000 people over the course of many individual dialogues, both in person and then, because we were doing during the period of the pandemic, online. And we also did some quantitative work, polling stuff. And the polling stuff's interesting, because what you find is that when you ask about things that are traditionally seen to be very difficult, like a policy which we didn't recommend and I would not recommend, a meat tax, we found that, you know, it's not a popular policy. Something like 45% of people support it on sort of first blush, but that's not so much the issue, actually. What we found was that there was a blocking minority. So perhaps 12, 13% of people were very energetically opposed to it. So, you know, immediately very strongly opinionated. And when we delved a little bit into the detail, we asked some follow-up questions through the polling. We found that they were hyper motivated by the idea that this meat tax was going to harm them in in a specific way. So I think the problem is not so much shifting that 45% of people who are like, well, I can kind of see the logic. I don't really like the idea of meat tax, but I can kind of get on board to being 55%, i.e. a simple majority. It's the blocking minority that is the political challenge for an intervention, which again, I wouldn't support and we didn't recommend a meat tax, but I take it just because it's something that has come up. So the way in which you get around that, I think, is through the process of deliberative dialogues and through building consensus and a mandate for change. What we found, having gone through the deliberative dialogues, was that actually politicians were far behind where the public was. And really, the typical experience was we'd have a conversation, we'd introduce the idea, the most difficult one. So the easy stuff is, ought we reduce the amount of high fat and sugar and salt foods that we consume, which in the UK is an absolute no-brainer. I mean, instantaneously addresses, not instantaneously, within a matter of weeks, addresses lots of personal health type issues, and very clearly has a sort of personal benefit. When we got to the really difficult stuff, to what extent should we intervene on meat? And that is the most difficult issue in my experience. In the first 2 minutes, what you'd find is a hyperpolarization. So people would self-segment into pure carnivores and pure vegans, and they would just be totally on the opposite sides of the fence. And we would have to sort of say, okay, we hear you, this is contentious, but let's just think about how we actually consume food and the food choices we make. And as soon as you break that initial polarization, people are actually like, oh yeah, I probably do consume a bit too much. And I've read about processed meat being bad for me. I should probably eat a bit less, even the people who self-identified as the carnivores. And the people who sort of self-identified as the vegans, I'm caricaturing slightly, but it's not too far from reality, would say, well, actually, yeah, no, there's a reasonable case here. I think there's a strong case for kind of well-raised, sustainable meat. This is all in a kind of rich country context, but the point is you very rapidly broke down that boundary. So I think the route to getting at dietary change is probably to take a leaf out of, for example, the Irish government's interesting experiments with assemblies to get normal, ordinary citizens to debate things beyond the simple headline, and then produce a recommendation for politicians to either act on or perhaps to ignore.
Thank you. Danush, do you want to add anything? Perhaps you have any Dutch examples to draw upon?
Yeah, not Dutch. I could go back again to the COP and COP's process, Tara, and I'm wondering, is it just the fear of backlash from voters or fear of backlash from big livestock industry? Yeah. And there's been some chat going on as well, and I think it's very much so a push from the industry and fear of that losing their competitive advantage. I mean, big livestock is a $900 billion a year industry, and few countries are dominating that, you know. So so certainly they see this as a threat. So very often in negotiations on agriculture, even, it's the same meat exporting countries who are blocking any kind of progress because they're afraid that it affects the competitiveness of their meat industry. So, and, you know, there is like an inherent motivation amongst the governments to protect the industry. Plus, there is also active lobbying from companies. I mean, there was the example of the Dublin Declaration, which was posted in this chat as well. So there is, and I've been seeing more and more presence of the meat industry in these climate meetings. There's a push for projecting meat as part of the solution. And again, my personal view is not that we go completely meat free. That's not going to be feasible. And it's not also about, you know, small farmers in Africa having 1 or 2 heads of cattle. But big livestock is a big source of emissions, and we need to tackle that in a bold and firm way. And we cannot just go around the issue and talk about it, but we really need to embrace the issue and talk about bold solutions.
So I guess one question is from outside government. If we have government feeling that it has its let's say hands tied from pressure from big corporates and from and voter fear, perhaps in combination, and then what is the role of non-state actors? What is the role of, for example, NGOs in kind of breaking this deadlock, this status quo? Are there things that civil society and indeed enlightened industries that they can do to help government do do its job, as it were.
Can I just quickly comment, Tara?
Yeah.
Just have been the role of NGOs and other players I've been thinking about this quite a lot. Like in my career, I worked with the private sector in the UN system, in the CGR system, in the NGOs, and I gave up on all of that and I started my own organization because I just didn't see the level of ambition that I would like to. And I also did my PhD on science policy engagement, right? And there are different kinds of engagement routes we can take. We can provide policy advice to a government when they ask for it. So they define the problem and we provide them ways to improve their problem-solving capacity. We can also do assessments like the 8 Lancet Commission is doing, bringing scientific community together to do that. That's also another form of science policy engagement. But I feel that both are important and we need to continue doing them, but it's just not at the level of ambition that we'd like to see. So what I'm kind of doing and Climate is kind of doing is to be the disruptor at the moment. We are kind of trying to call out the big issues in the system, and that upsets a lot of people, but somebody needs to do it, right? So that's kind of like, we think about it as being like a constructive disruptor. So like the meat industry, what are the issues? Just call it out, because very often in the policy space, we have to be so diplomatic and careful. We cannot actually confront the issue. And then, but at the same time, be constructive and let's see what happens as a result of that. It's an experiment in progress. But my key point is we need to really change our approach towards engagement. Otherwise, nothing will change.
So shall I jump in as the
Yes,
other non-government organ? I imagine this might be a difficult one for you to answer. I guess what I see in the non-government actor space is a confused set of theories of change, and I'll bundle 4 in there because I think they give you different routes to political effectiveness. So the standard one is exhortation. So we ought to change our diets for reason X. I think that's fine. That's helpful. It's the equivalent of information provision in a change model. You need it, but on its own, it basically doesn't do very much. But there are sort of 3 other routes to change that I think we need to explore a bit more carefully. The first is perhaps removal of some of the indirect subsidies that support unhealthy and climate harmful sorts of diets. So by dint of the sort of agricultural subsidies that we use, particularly in the wealthy world, we subsidize large amounts of grain production, sugary, fatty kinds of foods, and obviously quite a lot of livestock. Changing that is incredibly politically difficult. It's the kind of direct route. It upsets lots of actors. It is the thing that classically a livestock industry would say, hang on a second, you can't undermine the subsidy that supports our industry. But there are sometimes routes for that change. And again, to ground it in UK experience, within the 4 countries of the UK, there are various different speeds of travel on changing the post-EU common agricultural policy into something else. It's an experiment that we're still running live, but there is a way perhaps to move away from at least the most harmful bits of subsidies. That's one route. And NGOs in the UK have been relatively effective in supporting that to become more like a payment for ecosystem services type of model rather than the traditional one. There's a direct taxation route, and this is what we proposed in the National Food Strategy. Again, probably the most politically difficult, but I raised the issue of this junk food cycle. Well, we've got to disrupt the economics of the junk food cycle, and the way in which we proposed to do that was by taxing salt and sugar, 2 of the nutrients of concern. We didn't touch fat for reasons I'm happy to answer in the questions. That didn't get over the line, but the route to it getting over the line is speaking to a government and saying, look, would you like to, if I were framing this for a centre-right audience, I would say, would you like the size of the state to continue to grow in order to pay for a health system which is being, the demand for which is being inflated by bad quality business models with large externalities? There's a kind of center-left version of it, which might focus a bit more on the lived experience of people who get sick and then expect a healthcare system to patch them up, which is effectively what they do. And there's a health-driven case, I think, for a direct taxation change, which civil society is well placed to make, particularly if the environmental groups and the health groups can get together on that. And then there's a third approach, which I think is new and is a bit of a bet, and somebody's already mentioned in the comments, and that's alternative proteins. So whether it's cellular agriculture, whether it's precision fermentation, whether it's just sort of eating plants in a slightly more sophisticated way, there is the prospect that if we were able as society to make these things cheap, then you've got a route to not asking people to change their flavor preferences so much as to substitute for a product which certainly has lower environmental impacts, and if we do it well, could have better, perhaps not totally benign, health impacts. And creating that option which says to people, well, you could change your diets and it wouldn't be dramatic and terrible. It would perhaps be like switching from driving a petrol or diesel vehicle to switching to an EV. Not a panacea, but perhaps quite helpful in a system which needs a lot of disruption in order to make change.
Thank you. I mean, I am going to ask this question to you, Argunun, as well, because I think the role of both civil society and industry can make your job at FAO easier or harder. So I just wondered how you think about the influences of those actors and how you engage with them.
So we are definitely a part of multiple platforms, multi-stakeholder platforms, such as the Sun Movement, where you have a diversity of both UN, businesses, NGOs, the coalitions that I was mentioning that came out of the UN Food Systems Summit. And actually, I guess some of the main aims of the coalitions that came out of the UN food systems were exactly this: to make everyone come to the same table and have these discussions around food systems transformation. But just overall, I mean, for us as the UN, we always need to be representative of all the different contexts, and I think being context specific. And so the conversations that have happened today previously as well around meat, for example, of course, the reality for UK is very different from the reality of, just taking an example off the top of my head, Zambia. So we always need to be mindful of this within the different platforms that we're a part of, where we do interact with businesses or NGOs or other types of entities, but also within our own work. And I think to clarify, I mean, our combined strength is really what can drive the change towards this transformation of food systems. And so everyone's role is essentially crucial towards the changes that we want to see, whether it's the private sector or it's NGOs and civil society or the UN, in support to the governments to achieve these changes.
Sorry, I had my mic on. Just you've alluded to it already, the very different starting points between many countries in the global south and those in the global north. And often the very difference between these starting points sometimes gets used on the one hand to say that sort of environmental NGOs in the global north want the whole of the world, including people who are living largely on millet and cassava, to carry on with those diets without having any dietary improvement, which might include an increase in animal product consumption. So sometimes that debate itself becomes kind of quite polarized and politicized. My question is, if we think of the kind of traditional understanding of what the nutrition transition has been, which has been a transition from, let's say, more traditional towards more so-called westernized processed diets, the idea being that there will be kind of a benign transition away from those eventually, is what are the prospects for actually, and we can question whether that narrative is actually correct, but what are the prospects for some kind of leapfrogging occurring so that countries in the global south, populations in the global south, don't have to kind of go through a kind of high meat nutrient diminishment of our diets that we're having today, and that we can, let's say, contract and converge upon diets that are like better for everyone as a global community. I mean, do you have any thoughts about how we might even have a narrative about that, really?
Right. So I think what's important to remember is that there is really no solution that fits everyone. And so therefore, if you want to have a single specific guidance on how to achieve this globally, I think that's close to impossible. And that's why we need to have this context specificity. And I think that's really key in this discussion, because you might say, oh, some of the guidance that I see coming out of FAO, for example, is too general, but that's essentially purposefully general, because the countries and the governments are in the best position to understand the way that they want to reshape their food systems and how they want to shift their diets to become more sustainable. What we can do is to provide the tools and the knowledge and expertise and that collaboration towards that aim. But we can't really say that we have a silver bullet and that's it, and that's how you do it. It's just not the reality when working at the global scale and at the global level.
Thanks. I would be interested to hear from any of the speakers of any positive, actual, tangible case studies we've heard of dietary shift. And if that is not possible, then positive examples of action on something difficult that government has been bold and taken the lead and done, and it's worked. Yes.
Shall I channel my inner West Coast optimism?
Right.
I think there are probably two things to say. The first is that we know that diets can and do change, and not always for the worst. I mean, the economics of the system have driven us in the West to eat worse diets from a health perspective and also from an environmental perspective. But when we looked at how diet change occurs, we found that where there's a relatively simple substitution, so take in the UK, the shift from full-fat milk to 2% or semi-skimmed milk, that happened very rapidly. It was a ready substitution. It was driven by essentially a public health message. And because there weren't kind of cost or convenience factors that were in the way, the transition happened relatively rapidly. A more controversial and challenging diet shift has been the shift out of beef and into chicken, in what we see that in most Western countries. That's principally a price difference with some potential health questions or health messaging that went alongside that. But the key thing to take here is that our diets are absolutely not fixed. We can and do change them, and we change them in response to health messages, to fads. Another one we looked at is the shift from potatoes into pasta in the UK. That was driven, celebrity chefs and exciting exotic cuisines like an Italian cuisine that was apparently quite a thing in the 1970s. So we can change. I think that's the main thing to take away from that. As to a government-led difficult change, I think we need to learn more in the diet space from the energy system playbook. The last decade went from a world where we were talking about how we desperately needed coal for everyone because it was incredibly cheap, and there was no one who could see a route out of a coal-dominated power system, and a world where we were looking at 4 or 5, perhaps 6 degrees of warming. We totally changed the picture on that coal-dominated system, and I'll just draw out some of the things that worked well, which we might learn things from, and then I'll perhaps leave in it slightly with a electricity is not the same thing as food point at the end. So I think the story of that change was principally a nation state story, but global factors were incredibly important. So when the IEA finally kind of broke with the orthodoxy of decades and said, hey, we have this 450 part per million sort of scenario. We have the opportunity of using renewables and nuclear and kind of pick your preferred zero carbon technology to do things differently. It shifted mindsets and it shifted investment perspectives at a global level. And people were like, okay, this is serious. A well-respected global institution is saying that change is both necessary and possible. What the IEA didn't say is everyone is going to just use solar. So perhaps picking up on your points about, the FAO is never going to say this is the correct diet for all humanity, and goodness knows nobody would ever support that, and you wouldn't get past your members. At least being able to say these sorts of things are harmful, and the kind of very high meat, high sugar, high fat kind of diets that we have settled into in the wealthy world, I think everyone can agree is harmful, at least in kind of aggregate level. What happened then was a series of national processes where countries started to say, well, hang on, maybe we could make some change. What's going to work for us? So in the UK, a story I know well, I did a lot of work on the energy transition last decade. We decided that offshore wind was going to be a critical technology to enable that change. Across all of Europe, and this is when the UK was in the EU, we also decided we desperately needed to seek energy efficiency, and that might be the kind of eat more vegetables analogy there. And we built policies. So the EU regulates loads of products to make them more efficient, and the UK built an industrial strategy with support and partnership of the Dutch and the Germans and the Spanish particularly, to create this new technology that changed the shape of the game. The one thing I would say is that food is not, electrons are really boring. Food is culture, it's meaning, it's livelihoods for a lot of people. We don't notice that so much in the rich world, but in, if you look at your middle income or below, large numbers of people are employed directly in food production, in agriculture. So it's going to be a different sort of transition. But the point is we do know how to make those big shifts. And in the space of a decade, we have made a huge shift in the energy system.
Thanks, Dustin. Just a couple, of examples from Dinesh and Arganun, and then we're going to open up for some of the questions. Who would like to go first?
I thought because I went last, maybe you go first, Dinesh.
Okay, I can just do that quickly. So for me, messages of hope, optimism that I'm seeing. I'm seeing like a lot of interest in the alternative protein sector. I equate as Dustin mentioned, also to the renewable energy space, how it evolved. I mean, some of the countries which are big meat exporters like Brazil, India, we're also seeing them very interested in the alternative protein space. I mean, countries or industry, they're not stupid. If there's an opportunity, they take it. So last year we convened a consultation of stakeholders in India, which looked at potential for developing alternative protein industry further with the government, with a partnership with Denmark and other stakeholders. There's already a robust industry, but there's a vision and there's an intention to take it forward. And that's coming right from the Prime Minister's level, So we can see that kind of interest is there, because if this is going to be a big industry, India has to be a leader. And we're seeing that same kind of sentiment coming from Brazil and China, for example. So I can see that countries, while their political position in the UN might be, oh, we don't discuss diets, internally they're thinking, if there's a good business case, we want to be part of that. And we're seeing this also in some of the big meat companies, and they're also thinking about what's the business case here, how do you invest, buying startups and so on. So if this area on alternative protein really flies, I think that'll be like a carrot rather than a stick to help countries and industries shift towards that area. So that's kind of probably an area to place some bets and focus some of our energies to get that sector up, similar to what has happened for renewable energy. You're still on mute, Tara.
Go for it, Arganun.
Thanks. Thank you so much. So yeah, I just wanted to just coming off of these conversations now and the great inputs that Danush and Dustin brought up. One thing was on the livelihood aspect. I'm really glad that that was brought up because I think this is something we should not forget in these conversations, that half of the world's population currently get their livelihood from agri-food systems, and it's really important to consider this aspect when working towards the larger food transformation agenda, and consider the effects that these changes have on livelihoods. Because if people lose their livelihoods without having been trained in new skills, for example, they themselves and their household will be pushed away from achieving healthy diets. And so it's important that we adopt the leave no one behind principle here and consider how we can support people's livelihood transition at the same time as we transition the food system. The next thing I wanted to touch on was on the guidelines that we were talking about around sustainable. So there are guidelines in place, which actually FAO and WHO worked on in 2019. They were published. They're called the Sustainable Healthy Diets Guiding Principles, essentially, and they depict 16 steps or 16 aspects of what a diet would look like, which is sustainable and healthy. Just to give you a few examples, to start early in life with early initiation of breastfeeding, that these diets are based on a variety of unprocessed or minimally processed foods to minimize the use of plastics in food packaging, that the diets are accessible and desirable, etc. So there are guidances in place. So these roadmaps exist essentially, but countries and governments and their partners need to take them into consideration from their local context once again. Yes, maybe I can come back to the aspect I wanted to cover on the public food procurement, unless we have time.
Go for it. Yeah, just go for that, and then I'll open up some questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to cut short on the discussion, but we were talking about tangible tools, right, of how we can actually achieve these dietary shifts at the same time of them being sustainable. And public food procurement was actually mentioned as one of the so-called game changers during the UN Food System Summit in 2021. As an example of a concrete action that can transform food systems. And it has the potential to impact both food consumption and food production patterns. And just, I can give you some examples here where, which have used some countries that have used public food procurement as entry points for enhancing the role of smallholder farmers, for example, and empowering them and the local food system and value chain for school feeding programs in this case. And we've seen this in Brazil, Colombia, Ghana, and Scotland, just to name a few. So just another concrete example of a tool that could be used for policy influence as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to ask the first question we've got, and it's from Heidi Zamzo. And she says, and we've touched upon this a bit, but how much is the perception of government intrusion a barrier to shifting dietary norms or to policymakers taking leadership on the issue? How prevalent in your experience is the belief or attitude or perception that what people eat is a personal choice and that governments are overstepping and should mind their business? I mean, I think Dustin's partly kind of touched upon that in his discussion about deliberative dialogues, but I do think it would be interesting just to kind of explore this question a little bit more different, which is that where does government, where does it have to take its hands off, and where does it legitimately act, and are we free agents anyway? Big question. Who's going to go first?
Shall I jump in on this?
Yes, and don't feel you all have to answer all the questions.
Yeah, I think the straight answer is yes. The perception that a national politician, even though national politicians tend to feel they have quite a bit of legitimacy, certainly compared to sort of more global voices, they're very afraid of talking down to people or being seen to say, you, whoever you are, this is what you should eat. There is a strong construction of personal choice, which is frustrating because it is totally at odds with the academic evidence, which essentially says food environments very substantially shape how we eat. The place in my experience where that conversation is easiest to have is on the health side of things. Again, there's a very strong body of academic evidence, which essentially says the choices which we are given, the choice architecture that's presented to us is, if not wholly determinative, obviously we always retain the choice, do I have that Twinkie or do we have that Mars bar? But if my choices are a Twinkie and a Mars bar, guess what? I'm not going to end up with a healthy diet. So there is space to make the case there, and you would be surprised that the ability to intervene, the political sense that one ought to intervene, is not a kind of, it doesn't fall neatly on any kind of political divide. So when it comes to health, I have certainly had conversations with, in the UK, Conservative ministers who very strongly see the case for state regulation, particularly on promotion and marketing, in favour of healthy diets. And that's from ministers who you would otherwise think, well, this minister is on the libertarian end of the spectrum. You can construct a very coherent libertarian compatible case that the externalities generated by food companies are harmful to the system as a whole, and therefore there is a prudential, sensible, libertarian compatible argument in favor of state intervention. But you have to get past the initial sense that what are the headlines going to say? Am I going to be accused of telling you or you or you what to eat? That's quite a powerful disincentive.
Does anyone else want to come back on that? Okay, so there's another question, and this one is from Colin Sage. And again, we have touched upon this a little bit. Despite the overwhelming scientific evidence in support of the case for lower meat diets, the pushback from the meat industry in consort. Sorry, I've just lost it again. It jumped just a minute. Ah, yes, here we are. Sorry, let me read again. Despite the overwhelming scientific evidence in support of the case for low meat diets, the pushback from the meat industry, together with some scientific opinion in defence of business as usual, is very powerful. Does the panel have any thoughts about the seriousness of the Dublin Declaration, for example? I think most of you will be familiar with this declaration that was launched about a few months ago now, which made a very, very strong case. It brought together a bunch of scientists, arguably with strong industry connections, to argue for the benefits of animal source foods in the diets, and highlighting the beneficial role that livestock play in many aspects of our life, and underplaying the environmental disbenefits. Do you have any thoughts on lobbying tactics such as these, and how influential they can be, and how perhaps they can also be combated?
I could just try have a go. And I speak about this more from this COP and intergovernmental processes. And we certainly see more and more of lobbying, and I can certainly see that coming up in COP28 as well. And that's, again, I go back to the point, it comes back to big livestock, so it was interesting. We were looking at the example of Ireland, and it's about 55% of the farmers are only earning about 10,000 euros a year, and 3% earn over 50,000 a year. Most of the money is actually made by a handful of big livestock companies, but what they've been successful in doing is that creating a lot of false narratives, so around livestock and meat and so on. So I think what we really need to unpack is try to get the real narratives out, because very often, Tara, you mentioned this as well, there's so many conflicting and often confusing narratives out there, and we need to unpack them and show what's real. And I think my big issue is with big livestock, and that's the same as big oil. And how can we really understand this industry, and how can we make that industry transition? Because it's not really about the smallholder farmers here in terms of shifting practices at a large scale. But big livestock also has big capacity for lobbying, and there's increasing presence in climate conferences, and we are seeing that. So unless we take active efforts to actually confront some of these false narratives and put the facts out there, there is certainly that risk that we saw with the Dublin Declaration that could also happen at COP28 or another climate meeting. So I think it's us as civil society, we have to keep that industry and the UN and who's convening the process accountable to the ambitions of climate action.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I just mention? I think there's a really infuriating thing that I see out of this type of narrative, and it seems to me to be straight out of the playbook of the coal industry circa about 2003. So the coal industry essentially said, look, there are poor people in the world, they deserve access to energy, which is something I think everyone would agree with. And then they said, and therefore we must have coal, because coal is the only solution for cheap energy. That's it. If you're anti-coal in a country like the UK, where of course there are poor people in the UK, but the issue is not principally access to energy. We have plenty. It's affordability of energy. They sort of said, well, we can't get rid of coal. And I think there's a similar argument going on here. I don't think I have heard anyone who's making a case for lower meat diets saying that African pastoralists for whom livestock are an essential part of their livelihoods, and for people, as you alluded to, whose principal dietary related challenge is undernutrition, a bit of milk and meat in those societies would go an awful long way to supporting people's health. I've heard absolutely no one say that that should be denied to people. But this sort of theoretical argument is weaponized in, well, you know, if there are people in the world who are suffering because they don't have access to enough milk and meat, then everyone must always have more. It's a simple logical fallacy, and in a way I think it's helpful. Obviously civil society needs to point that out, but we should draw out that there is a rhetorical sleight of hand going on here to identify where science is being used in a way that is, you know, broadly in line with its purposes, or where it's being weaponized for a form of political polarization.
Thank you. Shall I move on to the next question? And this comes from Bill Grayson, and he asks, the UK is witnessing, and I'm sure this is true in other countries as well, is witnessing the inception of numerous local food groups where communities start to come together to share ideas that can help build their own food system. Is this a significant new movement that could send messages to help government take a more pro-health stance on food policy? So it's change incentivized from the bottom up is essentially the question. Where do you see the role of local grassroots movements and practical examples? Who'd like to go ahead? And the FAO must draw upon some of these when compiling its kind of case studies of good practice.
Sure, yeah, I can speak to an example from the grassroots level, not perhaps directly related to this question, but just highlighting the importance of the grassroots entities that exist. So working in the food and nutrition division of the FAO, we see a lot of these grassroots movements for better nutrition outcomes being coordinated through the Sun movement. And so I guess this once again goes to show the importance of having both the big players and the smaller players around the same table, but also understanding how these types of coordination mechanisms work at the local context, because Sun is obviously active at the global level as well, and a key player in the field of nutrition in being this multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder platform. But at the local level, just drawing from an example in Malawi, when I worked there on a stunting prevention program, it was really the coordination at the grassroots level that led to the successes of that program, which was coordinated under the Sun movement. And it was a complete bottom-up approach, which led to its successes. So just an example there from Malawi.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on local movements?
One local thing which we found in developing the national food strategy, which was inspirational, and it touches on the public procurement thing, is a scheme in the UK called Food for Life. So this is a procurement process led by the organic movement to provide school food, and the kind of thinking behind it is that quite a lot of school food in the UK is provided by very large companies. It's bluntly not that tasty, perhaps not that healthy, and the sort of Food for Life people thought, well, we can do a bit better, and we all can also kind of get around this idea that we just have to optimize everything for the cheapest possible food. Obviously, school food in the UK is a budget that's under pressure, like all the rest. So they took an interesting approach to diet change. They didn't talk about things. They source exclusively organic food, which is more expensive than conventional food in the UK, and they changed the recipes. So what you ended up with is a menu where structurally they empowered chefs more, and particularly chefs within schools individually, rather than just relying on centralized catering. They were able to then absorb surpluses, seasonal surpluses of food. So you would be eating more apples when the apples were in season, or what have you. And in order to balance the sums, they gave a bit less meat than in the standard approach, but it was a robustly omnivorous kind of offer for students. And when we looked at the assessment that had been done of it, the price is the same as the conventional approach. The satisfaction from pupils is higher. And what you get is a food system that looks a lot more like it fits within the sustainability limits that we need to do. So as an example, that real life we did it is enormously influential in shaping the National Food Strategy's recommendations on public procurement. And goodness knows, I would love to see many, many more of those, because there's tons of good practice out there.
So this comes back to the question of how can existing good practice be scaled up and rolled out. And yeah, Danish, do you have any comments on the kind of local action or observations?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Okay. So, okay, I'll move on to the next question, which is from Stephen Thornhill, and he refers to the recent FAO SOFA State of Food and Agriculture report. Does the panel believe that the true cost of food calculations given in last week's FAO SOFA report might be used in policies to make low emission, low resource use and healthier foods less expensive, and vice versa? So the incorporation of these externalities as benefits and costs would make markets more efficient according to economic theory. It would make beneficial foods cheaper and make people healthier. So that's his ask. So it's really about internalizing the externalities. Do you have any? I mean, you, Dustin, talked about the meat tax and how that was considered. Do you want to say a little bit more about that, and also sugar pricing as well?
Yeah, I'm just rapidly trying to Google this the report, because I'm afraid I haven't had a chance to read it yet.
The general principle holds,
the general principle, yeah. I mean, just on the true cost of food analysis, we looked at several different versions of true cost of food accounting in the food strategy, and I've done so subsequently. And I think there are a couple of things to say that we should be aware of when thinking about whether they properly capture all the externalities. The first is that where they are dominated by kind of Western analysis, what they capture is an awful lot of health system cleanup costs. So have a bad diet, the cost comes out in very expensive medical care, particularly in countries like the United States or the UK, where we spend extraordinary amounts of money extending people's lives, managing the consequences of diet-related disease. So when you top that up next to, for example, the greenhouse gas emissions figures associated with food production, typically on a kind of pounds or dollars or euros per ton of CO2 type basis, you end up with looking like the healthcare costs are very high compared to the environmental costs, which in one sense is true. That is fiscally what we pay, but I think it underplays some of the externalities that are created within the food system. So I guess my sort of summary on this type of externality analysis is it's really helpful, because what it typically says is we are not internalizing the costs of our diets, and therefore there is a prudential case to intervene to change them. But I wouldn't put a huge amount of store on the precise analytical drivers beneath them, because there are lots of things we don't monetize. And one thing which I haven't mentioned, but I will just sandwich in here very quickly, is the value of the natural world, by which I mean biodiversity and the kind of living planet. We are terrible at monetizing that, and I'm pessimistic that we will do so. So that's a missing figure in that true cost type analysis.
There's a whole question of whether we ever should do so either, but that's another discussion. I mean, just to ask you to continue a little bit on the question of the meat tax and why you decided, why you were very upfront in saying you weren't in favour of it.
I think there are a couple of objections to a meat tax. The first is that the reality is there would be a distributional consequence. People who are lower on the income scale would see the common foods that we all eat rise disproportionately more. So you would end up with a social effect. And that felt like it was difficult to square with what most people would find acceptable. The second is that it generates a lot of salience in an unhelpful way. The argument is that we're taking away your meat and you don't have personal choice. And this is a kind of, the state is taking something away that is, for most people, I was going to say the four N's, but I always forget what they are, normal, natural,
It's very
something.
natural and nice.
And nice, yeah. And you know, when you say we're going to tax this thing that most people just think, well, yeah, but it's nice to have a sausage, and it is. That's just political kind of death. And then the third point was this polarization point. When we delved into the kind of polling data, what we found is that it activated a small group in society very, very intensely. And what we know, so I work for a think tank, so I think a lot about politics. What we know about the politics, certainly of the Anglo-Saxon world, which I can say something about, but I don't want to generalize beyond that, is that the mobilization and weaponization of small, intensively, kind of very interested, very active groups is increasingly what's driving polarization in our societies. And generally, they lead to very poor quality policy outcomes. So we thought this looks like it's kind of intellectually correct, but there are lots of ways to kind of get to a lower meat, much healthier diet without having to shoot the blunderbuss at the problem.
Thank you. Argonin, since this was published by your very institution, do you want to say a few words about it?
Sure. So this is published by another division in the FAO, but it is a yearly report that's coming out, and we do recognize as FAO that this is a complex topic, but we are making advances in being able to compile the evidence and trying to capture the true cost of food in these calculations. And from my understanding, the next year's SOFA will still be committed to this topic because of the importance and the interest that's been received, and the aim of the organization in moving forward with this narrative. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Danush, do you have any comments on?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that Dustin mentioned about, intellectually, some of the concepts might be very clear to us and it might be economically quite convincing, but I think it's not the absence of intellectual ideas and the evidence and the economic case that's not getting action happening, right? So I'm slightly more skeptical that these true costs will be accounted into policies at scale, in the short or medium term. In the long term, that's certainly the way to go. But I don't see that happening immediately. Maybe if we put concerted efforts into it, we could probably get more and more countries applying that. But I don't expect that to scale because it's a political issue, not necessarily an economic one.
Thank you. So I have one other question. Actually, this is also from Heidi Zamzo, but it's a good question. What do the panelists think about the potential of small to medium enterprises and institutions to push for a change in social norms from within their own sphere of influence? So, for instance, some tech companies like LinkedIn have started to make this move. Any thoughts about the role of not big companies, but small to medium ones?
So maybe it's quite interesting. So we recently did like a search for innovations in food systems, and which are like game changing. So we looked at 240 of them, just from the literature, from the news, from social media, and then we found many of these small and medium enterprises. It could often be a spin-off from a university who like experimenting with new technologies and which they would like to scale and can be transformative. Some of them were in livestock, some of them were in plant nutrition, so multiple sectors. So we certainly see the promise in terms of the ideas, because the innovation is really happening in these small and medium companies. But one of the challenges we came across was this valley of death that small and medium companies face. So, when they have an idea, they get seed funding, but to actually commercialize and get it that to scale, many of them are struggling with that. So they cannot cross the valley of death and become a successful competitor to the mainstream alternatives. So this is something which we noticed. So, and that's an interesting question we're trying to work on with a number of players. How can we help companies bridge that or get through that valley of death and commercialize? But certainly a lot of promising innovations are coming out in business models. If we can kind of figure out how they can be scaled, that'll really help.
Thank you. Any other comments on that?
Yeah, I'll just jump in here. I think even in a affluent country like the UK, the food manufacturing end of the spectrum is actually dominated by SMEs. We often think about the big food companies because they are highly influential, but there are a lot of SMEs out there. And the area where I have seen the most interesting stuff is actually in the alternative protein space. So, and that spans the very, very high tech. I've spoken to UK-based cultivated and California-based cultivated meat companies trying to grow, bluefin tuna from cells, for example, which as an environmentalist I'm very keen on because it's an endangered species, and goodness me, we ought not eat any more of wild-caught bluefin tuna. But sushi is also very, very lovely. So if we can have that without the endangered species, I personally will be very happy. All the way across to stuff that is, in a sense, relatively low tech, but innovative in the way in which it's being pulled together. So this is another alternative proteins example. There's a company called Simplicity Foods with a Y, S-Y-M-P. And it was a guy who's a serial entrepreneur in the UK food sector who thought during the pandemic, I've got some time. The food sector was obviously fairly significantly hit by the pandemic as people stopped going out to eat for obvious reasons. And maybe I will try lactic acid fermentation of vegetables and see whether I can replicate some of the meaty kind of animal food flavors that people love. And so he's basically just started pickling loads of things. I mean, fermentation is old as sort of civilization, I guess, and come up with really innovative, really interesting flavors, which could be scaled and which provide a kind of relatively low tech version of alternative proteins. The point about SMEs is you've got this ferment of excitement and different ways of doing things, and goodness knows we need a lot of innovation in the food system. I suspect that will come from SMEs.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, look, we are nearing the very end of the evening, and I would like to end by asking you each one question, which is what is the one? And I know it's not a fair question, but what is the one thing that you would like governments to actually do to shift things in a better direction? Danish.
Yeah, very quickly, and it came in the questions and caught my attention. It's all about power and the power relations in the food systems, whether it's the SMEs or big business, or it's plant-based foods or meat industry. And if governments can really look into the power dynamics and we can think about resetting those power dynamics, I think that's where the big win is.
Does that mean it's going to commission more research to look into the power dynamics, or does it mean that it's actually going to seek to somehow rupture those or disrupt those power dynamics?
Disrupt. My view is like we need to approach the problems and solutions in a different way. We are doing it in a very business as usual way. If we try to look at it with the lens of power and how can we disrupt, create new power dynamics, shift where power is placed in the system, that can really change the outcome that we have.
Great, thank you. Who'd like to go next?
I can go next. Yeah. So I would say the key is coordination within the government ministries, communication between them, and knowledge exchange. Because at the moment, it's not necessarily that the Ministry of Trade doesn't know how important nutrition might be within their regulations, but it's more around the coordination process. And so creating that open communication among the different ministries to make them understand why do we want to shift towards sustainable food systems by still promoting healthy diets. And I think that this change needs to come from within the governments, but with us as UN, civil society, academia and research, private sector, etc., providing the tools needed to actually go towards that direction. Yeah.
Right. And Dustin, in the last minute.
Thanks. I'm going to say two things. Sorry, I can't constrain myself to just one. And as a good think tanker, I've come up with two labels. So I think governments need to disrupt and democratize. My key disruption thing is to fund alternative proteins. This is an early stage sector. It's a really interesting technology. It's not a panacea on its own, but the reason why it's interesting is because it can change both the power dynamics within the system, as Danush suggested, but also give people an option which feels a lot less like wearing a shirt, just eating vegetables. Vegetables are delicious, but many people construct them as being less flavorful than meat or dairy. And the other is to democratize how we talk about diets. The easiest way of doing that, I think, is to draw some inspiration again from the energy transition. A decade ago, a brilliant chief scientist in the UK named David Mackay built something he called the carbon calculator, which essentially gave you as an individual the ability to kind of change how the energy system worked within the UK. And then the British government developed this as a tool, which was used in lots and lots of countries to, work out what the energy system might look like. It was a kind of simple calculator with lots of ability to play with, and it allowed people to have conversations about, I like this energy technology, I don't like this. We could build a land calculator or perhaps a diet calculator to have those nation state-based conversations, which says, isn't top-down global governance says thou shalt, but instead is what are the options? How might we do things? Do these things add if we put them together? And democratizing those conversations has to be a part of the diet shift.
Thank you. So that's power lens, coordinate, disrupt, and democratize. Well, thank you very much to all three of you for a really fascinating discussion, and we'll be writing up and publicizing the notes, and this recording will go up in a few days, so do please share to anyone who's interested. So wish you all a very good evening, and thank you once again. Good night.